In the winter of 1887, deep in Idaho Territory's Bitterroot Range, something strange was happening in a lonely log cabin perched above the frozen creek. While every homesteader in the valley was burning through wood piles like their lives depended on it, one man, Elias Thorne, a 69-year-old hunter from Iceland, slept soundly through nights that dipped below 20 Tyler Fort. His neighbors stayed up in shifts to keep their fires fed. Elias let his burn out by midnight. By morning, frost coated the landscape, horses' breath hung in solid white sheets, and the air cut like broken glass. Yet his cabin remained warm enough to sit comfortably without gloves. People couldn't explain it. They knew Elias as the quiet type who kept to himself, a man with a slow, steady way of working and an odd habit of studying stones the way others studied weather. But this bordered on impossible. The valley had seen tough winters, but this one was different, early, sharp, unforgiving. Every hour of burning meant survival. Every mistake meant waking to ice on your blankets. And somehow Elias needed less wood than anyone. The rumor spread quickly. His cabin wasn't built right. His chimney wasn't straight, and his hearth didn't look like anything a proper frontiersman would trust. But the results were undeniable. While other families shivered beside roaring flames, Elias woke to steady warmth coming from a hearth with no fire at all. That contrast created a tension no one in the valley could ignore. How did one old man outsmart winter itself? What did he build into that cabin that the rest had overlooked for decades? The truth was simple. Elias understood heat in a way frontier builders never bothered to learn, and winter was about to expose that gap for everyone to see. Elias Thorne didn't learn his heating tricks in Idaho. They came from a place far harsher where winter wasn't a season. It was a force that shaped every part of life. He grew up in rural Iceland, in a village where the winds could peel paint off a door, and where snow didn't just fall, it buried entire rooftops. Out there, firewood was scarce, storms lasted for days, and no one had the luxury of burning logs all night just to stay alive. People survived by learning to hold on to every bit of heat they could create. His family lived in a torfbay, a traditional Icelandic turf house built low to the ground, packed with stone and earth. The structure wasn't pretty, but it worked. Inside those homes, thick stone walls acted like natural radiators. You didn't rely on flames for constant heat. You relied on stored heat, soaked into heavy stone that released warmth slowly. Elias watched his father heat Eldhusstein, the cooking stones, until they glowed faintly, then set them into pockets around the room. The fire went out, but the house stayed warm through most of the night. That simple idea stayed with him his whole life. Fire is temporary. Warmth is something you trap and hold. When he sailed to America in 1849, he didn't carry much an axe, a small chest of tools, and a memory of how Icelanders treated heat like a precious resource. But when he reached the Rockies, he saw Americans doing the opposite. Cabins were built tall and loose. Fireplaces shot heat straight up the chimney. People burned through massive piles of wood and still felt cold. To Elias, this wasn't just inefficient, it was careless. He didn't think he was smarter than anyone. He just knew there was a better way, a way he had lived with since childhood. And by the winter of 1887, that knowledge was about to prove itself in a way the valley would never forget. When Elias settled in the Bitterroot Valley, he immediately noticed something that most men here had lived with. So long they no longer questioned it. The cabins were built fast, light, and wrong for the kind of winters this land delivered. Frontier builders valued speed, throw up 4 walls, cut a chimney through the roof stack, some stone around a basic firebox, and call it done. It worked fine in mild weather, but once deep winter came, these structures bled heat like cracked buckets leaking water. Gaps between logs sucked in cold air, no matter how much moss you packed into them. Roofs sat too high, allowing precious heat to rise and disappear. And the hearths, Well, they were the biggest weakness of all. Most were built with a simple logic: keep the fire big, keep it burning, and hope that the flames could outpace the freezing air outside. But big flames also meant big fuel demands, and Bitterroot winters were long. Men spent nearly every spare hour felling trees, hauling logs, and splitting wood just to keep ahead of the season. No one questioned the method because everyone used it. If your cabin was cold, you just burned more wood. If that still wasn't enough, you blamed the weather, not the design. Elias saw it differently. He saw homes that heated the air but ignored the structure. He saw fireboxes that wasted energy by sending heat straight up the chimney instead of into the room. And he saw neighbors who accepted nightly discomfort as simply part of frontier life. He kept quiet, observing, understanding the valley before making changes. But the weaknesses were obvious to him. Every night he watched smoke pour from chimneys and thought, there goes their warmth, straight into the wind. Something needed to change, and Elias knew how to change it. Elias never tried to convince anyone he had a better way. He didn't see himself as a teacher, and he certainly wasn't the type to lecture other men about how to build their own homes. But he did what he had always done. He observed. He watched how the valley lived, how they burned wood, how they fought the cold, and how quickly their cabins lost heat the moment a fire died down. To him, it was the same mistake, repeated 100 different ways. People depended on flames instead of design. So late that autumn, while others patched roofs and stacked wood, Elias quietly began tearing apart his entire hearth, not repairing it, rebuilding it from the ground up. At first, the neighbors were just curious, then confused, then amused. The thorniest reactions came from David Carr, a local stone mason known for his confidence and quick opinions. He took one look at what Elias was doing and declared it a disaster in the making. Elias's new firebox leaned backward at a strange angle. It wasn't square, it wasn't upright. And he kept hauling in stones, big ones, heavy ones, far more than any reasonable man would ever need for a cabin hearth. People muttered things like, he's too old to be doing this, or that thing will smoke him out, and some even worried he'd hurt himself. But Elias worked patiently, never rushing, never defending himself. He had lived through winters cruel enough to kill livestock in hours. He had slept in stone houses that stayed warm long after fires faded. He knew exactly what he was building. Most frontier builders thought a roaring flame meant warmth. Elias believed the opposite. A strong fire burns fast. A strong hearth holds heat. And with every stone he set, he moved one step closer to proving just how wrong the valley had been. By mid-October, Elias's project had gone from a curiosity to a full-blown spectacle. Every few days, someone would wander by his cabin just to see what bizarre addition he'd made. From the outside, it looked like he was overbuilding a blacksmith's forge, not a homesteader's fireplace. The structure pushed deeper into the cabin wall than any design the valley had ever seen. And the rear stones curved inward, forming a rounded belly, something no mason in Idaho territory would ever consider. To the locals, it was madness. To Elias, it was the heart of the system. He called it, in his quiet, accented English, the stone belly. The curved surface wasn't decorative. It gave the fire something flat walls couldn't, a broad, sweeping surface to absorb heat evenly. The firebox itself sat at a 38-degree backward lean, forcing flames to roll upward along the curve instead of shooting straight toward the chimney. Every inch the flame touched became a temporary storage tank for heat. Then came the part that startled even the men who tried to keep open minds. Instead of running the smoke directly upward, Elias carved a 30-inch internal stone tunnel that forced the rising hot gases to travel horizontally before reaching the chimney. This heat corridor, as he described it, acted like a sponge. The smoke lost temperature slowly as the stone absorbed everything it could. Most people saw the extra stonework as wasted effort. Elias saw a natural battery. He chose basalt and granite from the creek bed, dense, heavy, slow to heat but slow to cool. He spent hours tapping each stone with a small hammer, listening for the tight ringing sound that told him it wouldn't crack when heated. Neighbors shook their heads, insisting he was smothering his own fire. But Elias wasn't trying to make a big flame. He was building something far more important, a system that remembered heat long after fire was gone. As the hearth grew larger, so did the criticism. Frontier folks weren't mean by nature, but they were practical, and nothing about Elias's project looked practical to them. The curved stone belly seemed like a risky experiment. The heavy sidewalls looked wasteful, and the angled firebox, well, that was the part that bothered people most. No one could imagine how a backward-leaning fire chamber could draw smoke properly. David Carr, the stone mason, became the loudest skeptic. He stopped by often, usually with a half-smile that wasn't friendly. "You're walling in the fire, Elias," he said more than once. "Fire needs room. It needs height. Yours will choke itself before it burns a single log." But Elias never argued back. He laid each stone calmly, as if the doubt around him never reached his ears. When someone asked why he needed so much stone, he simply said, "Cold pushes hard. Stone pushes back." The answer didn't satisfy anyone, but it summed up his whole philosophy. When the chimney finally went in, offset low, and routed through the stone corridor, people truly thought he'd lost his mind. "That thing won't draft," David declared. "You'll be lucky not to die coughing in your sleep." Others nodded in agreement, yet Elias kept working, moving with the slow precision of a man who had learned long ago that confidence doesn't come from pleasing others, it comes from understanding your craft. Everything he built had purpose. Every curve, every angle, every pound of rock was placed exactly where he wanted it. And though no one else could see it, Elias already knew what the valley would learn soon enough. You don't win against winter by burning hotter. You win by holding warmth longer. He wasn't trying to impress them. He was preparing for the kind of cold only a man from Iceland truly understood. Most men in Bitterroot Valley didn't care about physics. They cared about staying warm, burning wood, and getting through winter alive. But Elias understood something they didn't. The fire wasn't the real heater. The stone was. He didn't use fancy words, but his hands knew what worked. And every part of his stone belly hearth followed one simple rule: make the stone do the work. The curved rear wall was the first key. A flat wall absorbs heat in patches, but a curved surface receives the flame's full sweep. As the fire rolled along the curve, it transferred heat evenly into the mass behind it. That's why Elias set the firebox at a 38-degree tilt, not for style, but to make the flames cling to the stone as long as possible. Then came the density. Basalt and granite aren't easy to heat. They take time. But once they're hot, they cool slowly, much more slowly than common river rock. Frontier builders usually used whatever stone was nearby. Elias selected each piece intentionally, knowing that a hearth built from dense stone could store hours of warmth. The internal smoke tunnel was the part no one understood. Most thought a chimney should take smoke straight upward. Elias forced the hot gases to travel sideways first, through 30 inches of stone. During that journey, the heat didn't vanish. It transferred into the structure. By the time the smoke reached the chimney, it had already given up a large portion of its energy. Elias didn't calculate numbers. He didn't measure heat in degrees or talk about thermal mass. He explained it in his simple way: flame is quick, stone is patient. To him, that was enough. The valley didn't need the science yet, but soon they would feel it for themselves when winter finally tested every cabin, and his strange design was the only one that didn't break. By early December, the valley felt the first bite of the season. The wind sharpened the sky, dimmed, and a hard crust formed on the snow that didn't melt even under midday sun. Everyone knew what these signs meant. A real winter, not the light kind, but the kind that punished mistakes, was coming fast. Families began burning wood earlier in the day. Smoke poured from chimneys before sundown. Men worked late into the evening, splitting logs they hoped would last until March. The mood in Bitterroot shifted from ordinary caution to quiet fear. Inside his cabin, Elias Thorne watched the weather change with a calm expression. He had seen storms bigger than this, storms that buried entire homes back in Iceland. So when he lit his first fire in the new hearth, he did it without hurry. He placed the logs along the angled floor, struck a match, and watched the flame crawl up the stone belly exactly as he'd envisioned. The fire didn't roar. It settled into a steady, controlled burn that filled the cabin with slow-building heat. By the time he went to bed, the hearth glowed a deep orange. And then he did the unthinkable. He let the fire go out. That same night, a brutal cold front swept down the valley. Temperatures fell below 20 degrees. Wind rattled shutters, seeped through log seams, and froze water buckets solid. Families took turns staying awake, feeding their fires constantly, just to keep the chill off their children. But Elias slept through the night without adding a single log. When he woke before sunrise, his cabin sat at a warm, steady temperature, comfortable enough to move around without gloves. The valley had barely entered winter, and already the difference was obvious. Elias's hearth wasn't competing with the cold. It was outsmarting it. The next morning, when Elias stepped outside, the valley looked frozen in place. Frost clung to every branch. Horses stood stiff, their breath rising in thick clouds. Smoke from neighboring cabins drifted low and heavy, a sure sign everyone had been burning hard through the night. It was the kind of cold that made metal brittle and turned simple chores into survival tasks. That's when David Carr came trudging across the snow toward Elias's cabin. He looked exhausted, eyes red from lack of sleep coat dusted in ice. Without knocking, he stepped inside, expecting to find Elias half frozen or desperately rebuilding his fire. Instead, warm air hit him like he'd walked into another season. What temperature is this?" David asked, stunned. Elias shrugged lightly, as if it were nothing special. "Warm enough," he said. He hadn't added wood since the night before. The fire had been out for nearly 8 hours. David touched the stone belly out of instinct. His hand jerked back in surprise. The surface still radiated heat, hot enough to soothe chilled fingers. Elias measured it with an old metal thermometer, around 120 to 140 degrees on the stone face. Not glowing, not dangerous, just steady, usable warmth. Meanwhile, other families were burning through piles of wood at alarming speed. Some had nearly emptied a full quarter of their winter supply in just a few days. Their cabins never rose above the low 50s, even with flames roaring. Word spread quickly. First disbelief, then curiosity, then something close to awe. How could one man using a small evening fire stay warmer than families running full hearths all night? Elias didn't brag or claim genius. He simply said, "The stone holds what the fire gives. I just built a place for it to stay." That was the moment the valley realized his crazy hearth wasn't foolish at all. It was a breakthrough. As the cold spell continued, the gap between Elias's cabin and everyone else's became impossible to ignore. Each morning, families stepped outside, bleary-eyed from fire-watching shifts, carrying fresh armloads of wood to keep their homes barely livable. But Elias, he carried nothing. Most days he didn't even relight his fire until late afternoon. Yet his cabin stayed comfortable, often warmer than the schoolhouse or the general store. Eventually, practicality outweighed pride. Men who once laughed at his angled firebox now approached with questions. They wanted to see the inside of the hearth. They wanted to understand the curve, the stone choices, the smoke corridor. Even David Carr, who had criticized the design at every stage, visited again, but this time with a small notebook instead of a smirk. "Your cabin holds heat like a bread oven," he admitted. "I've never seen anything like it." Elias didn't gloat. He simply showed David the system piece by piece, the angle that pulled flame across the stone belly, the thick sidewalls that acted like thermal tanks, the horizontal tunnel that squeezed every bit of heat from the rising smoke. He explained it plainly the way his father once explained it to him. Soon the interest spread. By the second week of the freeze, 3 families asked Elias to sketch a version of the hearth for their own cabins. By the 4th week, half the valley wanted help rebuilding before the next winter arrived. Elias agreed, but only under one condition. You help the next man. No secrets. That winter, something subtle but powerful happened in Bitterroot Valley. Heat stopped being just a fire you fed. It became a skill you learned, and the Thorn Hearth, as people started calling it, became the first real breakthrough the valley had seen in years. What began as mockery had turned into a movement, one that would reshape how the frontier fought the cold. As winter slowly loosened its grip, the valley found itself talking less about the cold and more about what they had learned from it. People began to realize that Elias hadn't just built a better hearth. He had challenged an assumption they never questioned. For years they believed the only way to stay warm was to burn more wood, build bigger fires, and work harder than the weather. But Elias proved something different. Survival wasn't only about effort. It was about design, patience, and understanding how heat truly behaves. Neighbors asked him why his system worked so well. He didn't use technical words. He didn't lecture. He simply said stone remembers, and then explained how the walls absorbed and returned warmth long after the fire died. His message was simple, but it opened people's eyes to a truth they'd overlooked. Sometimes the old ways weren't primitive, they were efficient. Frontier life had a habit of pushing people toward prideful independence. Most men believed that if they'd built 10 fireplaces, they understood everything about fireplaces. Elias's success humbled them. It reminded the valley that good ideas don't care where they come from, another country, another generation, another tradition. And sometimes the best innovations are rediscoveries of something ancient. People started talking about other forgotten techniques. Earth cellars their grandparents used, smoke-drying methods ignored for decades, and stone lining tricks for keeping food cold in summer and warm in winter. Elias's hearth had sparked more than warmth. It sparked curiosity. For the first time in years, the valley wasn't just surviving the frontier, it was learning from it. And beneath that shift was a quiet message Elias carried from Iceland to Idaho. Wisdom isn't old or new, it's whatever keeps you alive. By the time spring thawed the valley, Elias Thorn had become something he never aimed to be, the man everyone turned to for answers. He didn't seek attention, and he didn't enjoy praise. He still spent most mornings checking his trap lines and most evenings tightening tools by lamplight. But his hearth, the strange curved stone-heavy design that once drew laughter, had changed the valley's thinking in a permanent way. Throughout the following summer, men rebuilt their fireplaces with Elias's guidance. Not perfectly, each cabin had its quirks, but close enough to feel the difference. When the next winter arrived, families burned less wood than ever before. Cabins stayed warmer, people slept longer, and the valley realized something profound. They had been working against nature when they should have been working with it. Elias didn't charge for his knowledge. He never wrote it down, never claimed ownership. When asked why, he gave the same answer: every time my father taught me for free, I pass it the same way. He died in 1896, quietly in his sleep, just as he lived. When neighbors visited his empty cabin months later, they found the hearth exactly as he built it, solid, warm to the touch, even on a cool morning, ready for another winter that would never come. It stood there for decades long after the roof sagged and the logs weathered gray. The stone belly outlasted everything around it. People who passed through Bitterroot Valley would still hear the story. The old Icelander who understood heat better than anyone. The man who showed a community that tradition wasn't weakness, but a resource, and that sometimes the smartest thing you can do is listen to those who lived closer to nature than we do today. Elias didn't leave monuments or writings. He left warmth stored in stone, shared in spirit, and that more than anything is a legacy worthy of the frontier.